we get started? Okay. Well, thanks everybody for being here. So you're at the Stakeholder Advisory Group and Public Group information meeting for the South Tahoe Recycled Water Strategic Plan. For those of you that are here in person, welcome. And there's snacks and coffee over here on the to my left, your right. And for those of you who are online, thanks for signing in online and participating as well. So I appreciate everybody being here. I'm Elisa Garvey. I'm from Corollo Engineers. You'll hear about you'll hear from not only me, but other folks from South Tahoe, from the district. I'm the project manager on this project, and we're looking forward to speaking with you about this project, telling you where it's at and the direction that you'll see in the Recycled Water Strategic Plan, and obtaining feedback. So looking forward to it. Okay, so very quickly on the meeting agenda, just for the schedule tonight, we have the meeting penciled in for an hour and a half. So we have about an hour for the presentation portion. I don't think it'll take me an hour, but on the outside, it's an hour of presentation. I think I have about 40 slides, and I tend to talk fast, so I think it won't be an hour. And then, but after that, we will stop and open it up for discussions and questions and comments. So our presentation outline tonight is our welcome, which we're in the middle of here. I'll provide some background information, talk about the alternatives evaluation, system modifications that you'll hear more about exactly what those are. We'll talk through the decision analysis and tools that are parts of the Recycled Water Strategic Plan, have that Q&A session and discussion session, and then talk through the next steps. So why we are here today, or who you'll hear from today, this strategic plan, over the course of its development, we have had a project team that was the combination of Corollo Engineers and the district. And then along the way, we've obtained feedback from the public and the Stakeholder Advisory Group. So tonight you'll hear from Julie Ryan from the district and Shelley Thompson from the district, as well as myself. So I think with that, the general objective here of why we're all here today is to inform you on the findings that are compiled and presented in the draft Recycled Water Strategic Plan, to obtain feedback and input from this group, and to remind or inform you on the opportunity to provide comment on the draft Recycled Water Strategic Plan. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julie.
Good evening. I'm Julie Ryan. I'm the district's engineering department manager. And thanks, Elisa, for coming and making this presentation on our behalf today. Before I let Elisa get into the meat of the topic, I just want to set the stage and provide you a little bit of background context for why we are here today. A little bit more than 5 years ago, the district passed an important milestone in its history. We had been sending recycled water to Alpine County at our Diamond Valley Ranch for over 50 years. So that got the district's leadership team thinking, is our current process of treating the wastewater that's generated here in Tahoe and then pumping that water to Alpine County still the best way for our community to manage its wastewater? A lot has changed in the last 50 years: technology, regulation, public perception. So are there opportunities that might benefit our community that we are missing out on just because we haven't considered doing things any other way? So looking to the future, what challenges can we expect to face that might threaten how we currently do things? With all these questions in mind, STPUD decided it was time to develop a strategic plan for our recycled water system. We wanted to assess our process and identify current opportunities for improvement. That'll help those that come after us understand this particular moment in time. But we also wanted more than just a document that'll sit on the shelf. We wanted a tool that we can put to work when new challenges arise, something that will help us simplify the decision-making process when those challenges arise. Our consultant team, headed by Carollo, has helped us develop a strategic plan. It does all of these things, and we're excited to have Carollo here to present the results of this 4-year effort. So thank you. I'll let you take over.
Thanks. Okay, so I'll start with some background information. So a brief history of the existing system. The district was established in 1950. The district began, and Julie described this, the system that exists today, but the district began exporting recycled water to Alpine County in 1968. The Port of Cologne Act, and that was in response to the Port of Cologne Act, which required export of treated wastewater out of the basin by 1972, right? The district has a history of innovation and achievement. I mean, this is a treatment facility and system to be proud of. 100% of the treated effluent is reused. 100% of the biosolids are recycled as fertilizer, and there's electricity produced off the export system. So for this recycled water strategic plan, as Julie mentioned, this was looking out into the long term. We had a 50-year planning horizon for this strategic plan. And the overall objective, again, piggybacking off of what Julie mentioned, was to develop this long-term strategy for the district's wastewater effluent and reuse that incorporates viable alternatives to the existing system. And these alternatives would be triggered for implementation by existing or future drivers or constraints. I will mention here, and you'll see this as we get to the end, that the strategic plan doesn't identify one particular option. It identifies a suite of options. And that's where the concept of having a trigger system, a what if this anticipated trigger or driver were realized, then what may be the best option that the district could look towards, including, right, maintaining the existing system, right? So as we I want to just recap here this overall development process, the process for developing the recycled water strategic plan. We started back in the fall of 2021, and this period goes through where we are currently. You can see that we are here on the right-hand side. We're now in the fall of 20. And we started, with your basic process of a planning document or a planning process. We collected data and reviewed that data and information. We did some really detailed work on the legal and regulatory existing and potential future constraints or opportunities, both at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, right? And that was all, that was a comprehensive analysis of the legal and regulatory constraints and opportunities. We then went through the process of identifying alternatives. So looking at a real broad list of alternatives that were thrown out there as potential options and doing some preliminary analysis on those, enough to provide support for a screening analysis. So it said, okay, let's start with a bunch of these. We're going to develop them to a preliminary level so that we have sufficient information to then say, we're going to narrow that down to a smaller group and have justification for that. So we went through that alternative screening process, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. And then the evaluation process, and that's where those group of screened down alternatives were further evaluated and further developed. So we have more information on those. And then into all of that, gets incorporated into the draft recycled water strategic plan and then the final. So here we are again at the milestone of the draft. And you can see throughout this process that we've had coordination and input from the stakeholder advisory group, the SAG, as well as the public along the way. Okay, so just to review the existing system, I have a few slides here. This is an overview figure that shows the location of the district's wastewater treatment facility, the export line that conveys recycled water up and over Luther Pass, and then into Alpine County, where it's used at in the Diamond Valley Ranch area, conveyed to Harvey Place Reservoir, and then used in the Diamond Valley Ranch area for district operations, as well as ranch land irrigation by private landowners. So it's a 29-mile export line with a significant elevation change to get up and over Luther Pass. The district produces advanced secondary recycled water, and that recycled water can be used for fodder crop irrigation or pasture land irrigation. It's per requirements of the state of California. Right now, the existing flows are about 3.8 MGD. That's about 4,300 acre feet a year. A future flow was estimated at 5.4 MGD. That's about 6,000 acre feet a year. Oops. Sorry. Okay. So now looking at that end use of the system. So once that water comes up, down the hill off of Luther Pass and into Harvey Place Reservoir, it is used for district irrigation operations where alfalfa is grown and sold, as well as being conveyed to these parcels shown in pink there that are close to the California-Nevada border, and that's where there's ranch land, pasture land irrigation. That's the gist of the current system. So there are a number of challenges associated with the existing system. And these challenges in some ways were the drivers for thinking about, let's take a look at this system. And as Julie mentioned, make the evaluation of whether this is the system we are investing in and moving towards into the future, right? So there are economic challenges. The O&M costs are significant, about $6 million a year. And a big part of that cost, or a significant part of that cost, is the energy cost for that export system. There's limited revenue from the recycled water. There's some from the alfalfa, but not from the users for pasture land irrigation or livestock irrigation. From a regulatory perspective, there could be future regulations from the state board and the regional board that could trigger things like additional studies on a salt and nutrient management plan or other studies. From a technical perspective, current operations certainly require continued investment to maintain the district's established and desired level of service of production of this recycled water at its quality that meets those level of service objectives. From an institutional standpoint, there's a litigation between the district and Alpine County, and also there's the potential in the future. The rancher agreements for use of that recycled water will expire in 2028. So that's only a few years out from now. From an environmental and sustainability perspective, there is consumption of energy specifically related to that export system, right? That's an energy demand. And then from a public standpoint, there is just some general concern with the cost of service to treat and export effluent. It's a system that clearly requires, O&M costs, and that's the cost that's borne by the service area. Okay, so in the alternatives, with that, with that background, we looked at what could be some alternatives. Let's throw out a lot of alternatives that would be something other than the existing system. So just showing you schematically here what I described a little bit previously is that we started out with 16 alternatives plus the existing. Some of those 16 alternatives had some A's and B's, so it was really more like 21. So we started with a number of alternatives. We conducted that legal and regulatory analysis and the alternatives identification and screening process. And through that process, we reduced that number of 16 plus the existing alternatives down to 6 plus the existing alternative, right? And then, as we had input from the SAG and the project team and others and district management and staff members, we ended up adding 2 additional alternatives in the process. So we went from 16 down to 6, and then we added 2 more. So then we had 8 alternatives plus the existing that we did this further evaluation, more detailed evaluation on those alternatives. Clearly, we didn't do that much evaluation on the existing, so it was really further evaluation on those 8 alternatives to the existing system. And that was the group that was evaluated in our last technical memo and form the basis for the list of alternatives that I'm going to be talking about today primarily. Okay, so this alternatives evaluation, what's shown here, this is graphically shown, is the existing system plus the 8 alternatives, right? And so we will talk through all of these, but so you see alternative 1 is the existing system. Alternative 2 is an alternative where it's very similar to the existing system, but there are different additional parcels for secondary effluent irrigation in Alpine County. Alternative 3 is very similar to 1 and 2. It's just a higher level. It is a higher level of treatment that would allow you to do different types of irrigation that you can't do with the current secondary 2-3 recycled water. So for example, in California, to irrigate a park or a school or crop, food crop irrigation, you need to be at what is called disinfected tertiary. So alternative 3 involves upgrading the treatment facility to meet disinfected tertiary standards per the state of California, and then doing not only those secondary to those existing parcels or any other parcel for that lower level of reuse, but also additional parcels that would require this higher level of reuse. That's alternative 3. Alternative 4 is discharge to the West Fork of Carson. This one is similar and to 6A and 6B. And the idea between 4, 6A, and 6B is that there would be discharge to a surface water and then a downstream in Nevada potential use of that water through that augmentation of discharging to that waterway, right? So you discharge to the West Fork, that water is conveyed further down in the West Fork of the Carson watershed, and there's additional use of that water. You've augmented that water. There's use of that water downstream. Right. So that's similar to 6A and B, although 6A uses Indian Creek and 6B uses a pipeline and conveys that water to Mud Lake and then for subsequent reuse. Okay. And then there's 6C, which is indirect potable reuse in Nevada. So that would involve treatment at the existing facility, conveyance of that secondary effluent into Nevada, and then further treatment to meet potable reuse standards, where then that further treatment would occur in Nevada, and that further treatment would be conducted to meet potable reuse standards, then with an environmental buffer, injection and extraction. We'll talk more about several of these in a minute, but I'm going through these here for a purpose. And then the last one here is 7A, and that involves conveyance to DCL TSA, Douglas County Lake Tahoe Sewer Authority, and then export over Kingsbury grade with reuse in the Carson Valley. Okay, so among these 8 alternatives, I'm shading out here 4, 6A, and 6B. And I have information on these alternatives that we could talk about, but these alternatives have one common thread, right? They're discharged to a surface water. And for all of these surface waters, there are either direct receiving water limitations or governing downstream receiving water limitations that require.
I'm going to share your camera real fast.
Oh, okay. That require a very high level of treatment, right, with respect to nutrient removal, and potentially a level of treatment that you wouldn't even be able to get there, even if with the combination of nutrient removal and an energy intensive membrane process, right? So those alternatives for that reason are among these 8. Should I keep talking or do you want me to say?
Well, we're just, the folks online just can't see your beautiful face, so we're just changing
They
it
don't need
so
to
that
see
they can see your arms swinging, just like we can. You're doing great. You're doing great. But then it makes it more interesting for folks
Okay.
online. So you're doing great.
Okay.
That's it. Right?
Okay.
Okay.
So is that working?
It's working.
Okay, great. Okay, so that's the common thread between 4, 6A and 6B. So relatively speaking to the rest of these alternatives, those are more challenging with respect to technical and economic and regulatory feasibility. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about those in detail. If people have questions, I'm happy to answer the questions on those alternatives. And then the other one that I'm not talking about in detail is 6C, and that's this indirect potable reuse in Nevada. There are a number of things that would need to happen, including a Nevada community that would have a driver for water supply such that they would want to invest in the treatment process of taking secondary effluent and treating it to potable standards. And that in Nevada requires a number of treatment processes. It's being done in places in this country, but you would need to have a significant water supply driver in order to do that. As we stand right now, there isn't that water supply driver. If there were in the future, that would be the trigger to maybe potentially consider implementation of that alternative. But since we don't see that in the near or even medium term, potentially, I'm not going to talk about that alternative in detail today as well. Again, if you have questions, I have slides on it. Okay, so let's see. I am going to talk about the remaining alternatives that are not shaded. Okay, so the alternatives evaluation. So getting into details, I have a similar series of slides for each of these alternatives. And I'll start with alternative 2. So alternative 2 is very similar to alternative 1. It involves the secondary treatment at the existing facility, advanced secondary treatment. So to treat secondary 2-3, same quality of water, nothing changes the treatment facility. We have the export pipeline, and then that water would go for use not only for the district operations and as well as existing or different or more parcels for secondary 2-3 irrigation. So again, it's that pasture land or livestock or fodder crop irrigation. So that alternative would be triggered if there was, for a reason, insufficient recycled water capacity relative to the amount of effluent that was being produced at the treatment facility. So if you needed more recycled water capacity, then you could look for additional parcels that would use a very similar type of reuse similar type of reuse in Alpine County, right? So we identified some potential parcels, and those are, so what we're showing here is what's in pink is that there's an expansion of the district operations in Diamond Valley Ranch that could be expanded and more water could be used for alfalfa irrigation, as well as these parcels that are in purple that were identified as potential users of recycled water at this same level. So those several parcels that are shown in this map, as well as in conversation with the Washoe tribe, that while these parcels are not currently developed for ag irrigation or fodder crop irrigation or pasture land irrigation, if they were to be developed for that use, they would have potential interest in using the secondary effluent for irrigation. So that's alternative 2. So the key components of this alternative are the expansion of recycled water operations in the Diamond Valley Ranch area, the district's operations, and distribution system as needed to get the water to any identified new parcel that would want to use this water for irrigation. Right? Okay. And I'm going to show you this one slide, but we are also not going to come back to this unless folks want to see it. I want to mention that for each of these alternatives, we did an evaluation of the regulatory approvals and permits that would need to be implemented or obtained for that alternative to be implemented. And we broke these down into low, medium, and high. And this falls into, part of our evaluation of these alternatives relative to each other. So this was a type of analysis that we did. You can see it's very detailed. If you want to see this analysis for any of the other alternatives, I have that. But in this way, we were able to characterize, well, this alternative There's a number of things that would need to get done, but relatively speaking, it would be one of the easier ones to implement from a regulatory approval process, right? So that's the rationale behind doing this type of analysis. Okay, so that's alternative 2. So alternative 3 has some similar components, but it does first involve an upgrade of the level of treatment, and that's to go to disinfected tertiary reuse, and that water would be used then for irrigation in Alpine County. So all of the irrigation applications that I've mentioned could be implemented, as well as the additional ones that require this higher level of treatment. So export over Luther Pass, the DVR operations could remain. Different crops could be grown if that was desired. There could be additional parcels that would be using recycled water for landscape irrigation, as well as ranch land or pasture land irrigation. So this alternative builds off of alternative 2 in a way. And again, the reason why you would implement this alternative is that there would be insufficient recycled water capacity, right? Or, if there was some other driver or reason to go to a higher level of recycled water, whether that be a regulatory driver or other, right? So this alternative in this map, what we're showing is the additional parcels. I'll highlight those other parcels, but there are some small parcels that have existing uses that could take that higher level of recycled water for irrigation. So this is landscape irrigation at a cemetery and some school area, right? And in a future commercial area. In addition, this water, as I mentioned, could be used on what's shown here in pink and in purple. We talked about those in alternative 2, as well as those washout drive parcels, if developed for use that would fit with the irrigation allowances for disinfected tertiary. So the key components is an upgrade of the treatment facility to meet Title 22 unrestricted reuse, and then a distribution system to those users. Okay, alternative 6D. This is expanded reuse in Nevada via direct delivery. This alternative has some similar components. The treatment facility, based on the permit that DCLTSA has, that it is anticipated that this treatment facility would need to be upgraded for nutrient removal to meet a nitrogen limit of 10, a total nitrogen limit of 10. And that alternative also involves the export over Luther Pass. This water could be used if there was still demand for it in Alpine County. It could be used for all of those same uses that are currently provided, as well as any of those other disinfected secondary 2-3 parcels that we identified as possible users. But the idea with this alternative would be that this water could be conveyed and potentially not used in Alpine County and used for irrigation in Nevada. So ranch land or agricultural pasture land irrigation in Nevada. So what this alternative looks like is, again, it would be implemented if there was insufficient recycled water capacity, and if it was desired that the end use of recycled water for that to not be located in Alpine County. So those would be the triggers to implement this alternative. So looking at this alternative, the potential recycled water uses would occur in an area just over the border in, west of State Route 88 and south of Centerville Lane. You can see there's pretty high values of capacity there, or potential capacity for recycled water. And also the Bentley properties, which are, located a little bit further east, but that's a large parcel with a potential very high demand. The key components of this alternative would be that you'd have modifications to this existing treatment facility to meet anticipated nutrient limits. A conveyance pipeline would take that water further. You're down in Alpine County, then you take that water further across the border, and then a distribution system to get that water to those new users. Okay, and finally, alternative 7A. This alternative is quite different, right? Because this is the one alternative that we have that doesn't involve the existing export system up and over Luther Pass, right? So in this case, the secondary effluent at this treatment facility with the addition of nutrient removal, because that was put in there to meet the future anticipated permit limit of permit requirements of DCL-TSA. So we were meeting that same anticipated water quality requirements at that facility. Okay, this is the danger of me waving my hands. So we upgrade the treatment facility for nutrient removal, and then a pipeline from this facility to DCL-TSA. There isn't capacity at their treatment facility, and there actually is not capacity in the pressurized line that takes the water up Kingsbury grade on the DCL-TSA facility right now. So there is capacity just at the top, it just past Kingsbury grade. So the point of connection would be along that export pipeline. So the pipeline would go from here north towards DCL-TSA up to that connection point just past Kingsbury grade. And then that combined effluent would then flow in the pipeline, which would have to be upsized to combine the two flows, and then into Carson Valley for some similar uses that it's approved for in California, such as alfalfa irrigation and pasture land irrigation. There's also a storage reservoir, Buckeye Creek Storage Reservoir, which would need to be used or expanded such that you are able to match the generation of flow and the time of use, right? We only really want that irrigation water in the summer, right? So this alternative would be implemented, again, if there's insufficient recycled water capacity with the existing system here, or there was a need or driver for the recycled water to not occur in Alpine County. So up and over the Kingsbury grade and into Carson Valley, what's shown in this map are what's in green are the existing, the parcels that are currently irrigated by DCL-TSA's water. And then there are additional parcels that were identified shown in purple, and you can see that pretty high number of potential demand that could also or potentially would be interested in using this water for irrigation. So the key components of this alternative would be the treatment plant modifications for nutrient removal at this treatment facility, the conveyance pipeline to make that connection point with the existing export line, an expansion of that export line as well, and then the distribution to new users. Okay. So moving on to cost estimates, what I'm showing in this next slide is not only the cost estimates for the alternatives that we went through in more detail, but also the alternatives that we didn't go through in detail. So it's a complete list of the existing +8. And I want to note here that how we structured this is all of these capital costs are in addition. Sorry, all of these capital costs for the existing system, we said, okay, there's no capital cost. Nothing is changing with the existing system. So a zero capital cost was assumed. So all of the other alternatives are capital costs just associated with that particular alternative above and beyond the existing system, right? And for the O&M cost, there is an existing cost of operating the system. So in that case, we are showing the existing system O&M cost, and then we are also showing for all the other alternatives the additional O&M cost associated with that alternative. So you can see that these alternatives range in capital and O&M costs. I didn't do a great job of noting this as we went through, but as you saw in some of those recycled water capacity numbers, there are different sort of maximum or just potential recycled water capacity demands associated with some of these alternatives, right? The district in the future would be producing about 6,000 acre feet a year. That was our long-term projection. Some of the alternatives, like alternative 3, that really only adds about 80 acre feet a year, right? So if you only need a little bit of recycled water capacity, that would be a good one, right? The alternative 2 has a significant amount, a couple thousand acre feet a year, but alternatives, something like, let's just say hypothetically, you had 0 recycled water capacity that such as it exists today, and then there are some alternatives that could potentially take up to all of the water, right? Such as the alternative 6D, the expanded reuse in Nevada County, and also 7A. Those have a higher potential capacity. So it's all relative to what your trigger might be when I say you don't have sufficient recycled water capacity. The numbers are important. Are you close to having enough recycled water capacity, or how much, what's that delta that you need? And that influences how you might choose an alternative to the existing system. Okay. Yes. Are you adding something? No. Okay. Okay. So I want to quickly talk here about system modifications. We incorporated in this analysis what we termed system modification, and these were ideas that are not a recycled water alternative on their own. They don't necessarily take additional capacity, right, or provide additional capacity, but they are modifications to the system that could be implemented with one or more of the alternatives, and were incorporated so that we were comprehensive in this analysis. These were ideas that people brought up, and we wanted to analyze them and figure out, well, are there ways that some of these system modifications could be incorporated with these different alternatives? So our list here was that we looked at the potential of an urban fire protection recycled water system, and that would be providing recycled water or the availability of recycled water for use along an urban wildlife corridor or urban forested corridor that could potentially be used in a wildfire situation as a water supply. We looked at tunneling, and the tunneling that we looked at primarily in this system modification was in tunneling that would take that would allow a significant that significant elevation change to be reduced significantly, right? So that was sort of the tunneling concept that we looked at. We looked at split treatment, so the idea that you could have treatment at this location as well as potentially other locations, if that made sense for some of the alternatives. We also looked at export system energy recovery to expand those operations, and also constructed wetlands. So when we looked, and I can answer more questions about these if there are questions, but among these 5 system modifications, the urban fire protection and the tunneling, large-scale tunneling, were eliminated based on technical and economic challenges. The split treatment, that was actually incorporated into alternatives 3 and 6C. In alternative 3, we looked at, I didn't talk about this, but we looked at an option where instead of upgrading the entire flow at this facility, at the district's facility here, you could export the water at its existing quality and put a small treatment process, like a packaged treatment plant process, that would take a portion of the water and upgrade it to that higher level to meet those disinfected tertiary standards, right? And then just a small portion of water would be used because you don't have a lot of demand, at least right now, for that level of recycled water. So that was incorporated into 3. And then 6C was that indirect potable reuse alternative. And as I mentioned, that alternative involves the existing treatment at this facility and the purification treatment process that would occur in Nevada. So that's a split of treatment processes as well. So I'm going to talk in more detail today about the export system energy recovery and constructed wetlands. Okay, so for constructed wetlands, the idea was that their wetlands could be developed that could potentially provide additional capacity for recycled water storage in times or under certain hydrologic conditions when that would be valuable, right? And in addition to that, wetlands could provide water quality polishing, wetland habitats, ecological benefits, and possibly that wetland could be used as a wetland mitigation bank. And this system modification could be combined with any alternative that takes water up and over Luther Pass and into Alpine County. That's where we looked at developing these wetlands. So it's every alternative except for 7A, which was the conveyance over to DCLTSA, right? So what we identified here, and certainly there would be significant amount of additional work to verify, really to look at the regulatory feasibility of implementing a constructed wetland. But we looked at as a concept that there's approximately 30 acres of wetland that could be developed on, you can see it's the yellow area down near where the existing, the sea line is, then comes out of the pipe and goes by drainage channel in that area that feeds into Harvey Place Reservoir. So in that wetland, you could, if you needed to, inundate it by 6 feet, right? And if you took that 30 acres, 6 feet, that's approximately 180 acre feet of additional temporary storage. Now, if your flow is 5.4 MGD, then that would provide you an additional 10 days of storage. So in this situation, because the district has limitations on when it can release water for irrigation use, if you had a wet hydrologic year, then it might be advantageous to have that extra 10 days so that you could avoid being in violation of your permit, right? So that was part of the idea, as well as those other benefits that I mentioned around constructed wetlands. So that's the wetland concept. And then energy recovery. We looked at this both for the DCLTSA export line, and in alternative 7, that's the combined flow of DCLTSA's recycled water and the effluent from South Tahoe. In that combined flow, we looked at the potential for energy recovery on that pipeline. It's very similar to what I'm going to show here, because we also looked at this for the district's export pipeline, right? So for the district's export pipeline, we looked at 2 options. And one was one energy recovery system located in the Diamond Valley Ranch area. And the other alternative was looking at multiple systems along that down gradient section of the sea line, right? So we looked at 2 different, infrastructure configurations, right? And that has potential inclusion in all of the alternatives with the export into Alpine County, and the DCLTSA energy recovery obviously has could be incorporated into alternative 7A. So when we looked at this alternative, we had a flow assumption of the existing flow, and we have similar, but you can see with the one energy system in DVR that we have a higher potential energy recovery of 1.23 megawatts in comparison to the multiple energy recovery systems in series of 0.9 megawatts. The costs are quite different. And the reason why those costs are quite different is because to do that one single energy recovery system in DVR, it would require a significant upgrade to that sea line pipe to handle the pressures that would be realized in that pipeline. So it was a significant upgrade to that pipeline, and that's incorporated in that capital cost of $123 million, as compared to that $52 million capital cost for the energy recovery systems in series. So that was our energy recovery analysis. Okay, so finally moving on to the decision analysis approach and tools. As I mentioned, this recycled water strategic plan ends up with this suite of potential alternatives, right? And they differ in regulatory feasibility, technical challenges, economics, right? Among other characteristics, right? So the decision analysis flow chart here, which we're not going to go through, thankfully, because you see that and you know that you don't want to listen to me talk through that. So, but what it is, it's sort of a series of questions that are posed, right? It's the if then, like if this happens, yes or no. And depending on that answer, it leads you to a different part of that decision tree. So it incorporates those in triggers that I talked about, such as, insufficient recycled water capacity, or a specific regulatory driver, or, there is desperate need for water in Nevada just over the border, right? So those kinds of constraints and triggers are outlined in that decision diagram. And it helps think through, when faced with a future, existing or future triggers, what's my pathway? What alternatives could I look at? And then once you have that suite of alternatives, that may be potentially subset of the 8, right? 8 plus existing, then we also developed a multi-criteria decision analysis tool. So through looking at a number of different types of criteria, economics, regulatory, technical, among others, environment and sustainability, public perception, we developed an analysis where you could rank these alternatives relative to each other, right? So you put in scores based on the characteristics of those alternatives, and based on that ranking or that evaluation, the alternatives are ranked and incorporate those several different criteria, right? And it would support then your selection of, okay, well, I've narrowed it down to these 4 in my decision diagram. Now I have to pick from the 4. So how do I pick from the 4? And this multi-criteria decision and ranking allows you to, it supports, decision making on which ones to choose, right? So in the end, right, we have, by looking at the decision diagram in the multi-criteria analysis tool, we ran through 2 scenarios as a project team. And the first scenario was, let's assume there's sufficient recycled water capacity. For example, the rancher contracts are maintained and there's sufficient water capacity to do recycled water between the DVR operations and the rancher contracts and the rancher use of that recycled water. The outcome of that scenario, like under that scenario, the decision diagram and the multi-criteria analysis leads you to alternative 1, and that is maintain the existing system. Okay? We also looked at another alternative, and that was, is there insufficient recycled water capacity? For example, the rancher contracts change in some way, right? Now, certainly you have to look at the magnitude of that change, of the change in the recycled water capacity, but, the hypothesis here is that there's some change in your capacity to use recycled water in Alpine County, or by the existing landowners, by the ranchers in Alpine County. So when we looked at that alternative, that scenario, then the alternative that rose to the top was alternative 2. And that was to look for other parcels and landowners in Alpine County to replace the capacity that you lost under this scenario, right? So those were the 2, those are the 2 scenarios which we evaluated. We used the decision diagram in combination with the multi-criteria analysis decision tool to come up with the findings, alternative 1 and alternative 2 under those 2 different scenarios. Okay, so with that, I'll open it up to questions. And do we want to say here, or want me to do this? Okay. So obviously questions in the room, we're welcome to anybody to raise a hand and ask a question. As online, please go ahead and type your question in the chat box. We'll be monitoring the text, the chat on Teams, and we can answer your questions that way. And if someone is participating by phone, then you can press *6 to unmute and ask your question. So thanks for your attention. Happy to answer questions. Yes.
I was curious, what's the nature of the input you're looking for from stakeholders, people on the phone, people in the room?
Well, I mean, I think this outlines, I think maybe 2 things, right? I'm looking for, and hoping to have a general understanding. So before people can go ahead and read this, the draft recycle water strategic plan, the group sort of generally knows where it heads, right? Where the direction is. And then also if, you know, if this analysis, you know, when we stepped through the process, right, and we ended up with these, you know, 6 alternatives plus 8, you know, are these the alternatives that, you know, and are these the alternatives that is a reasonable suite of alternatives? And it does it make sense in terms of how we laid it out as being sort of a trigger-based evaluation of, you know, trigger-based evaluation to consider implementation of any of these alternatives. I think that's the kind of feedback I'm looking for. And I don't know whether Julie or Shelley have any additional thoughts on.
That's
type of
not
feedback.
right at this point in the process.
Right.
It's just getting a sense of, you know, does this feel right, like the right list
Yes,
to present, you know, to our successors to use and, you know, refer to based on what we know right now.
right. Yes,
So of the remaining alternatives or the at-large alternatives, is there one that the district considers to be the most compelling alternative or the most attractive alternative at this point?
no, because, well, okay. At this point, right, the district has recycled water capacity with its existing operations and the ranchers, right, with the contracts that they have. So provided that that is maintained, then the alternative, as I show you that we landed on,
Yeah.
the alternative recommended through this process, or the one that rises through the top through this process, is alternative 1, which is maintain the existing system.
So I guess
Right.
that would be the preferred alternative at this point.
Yeah.
Okay,
Is to continue with the
Well-
maintenance of the existing.
yeah, it seems like with the exception of, is it 7B or 7A, you would utilize the existing infrastructure for all of the other alternatives.
You would,
For the most part, there'd be little tweaks to it.
there are tweaks, right? When you think of the alternatives that are, that either involve, and we didn't go through the Mud Lake alternative, but with alternatives that involve a discharge or direct conveyance into Nevada, right? Then there is that additional infrastructure to get that water into those locations. And that the idea would be for those if there was a need or trigger that the water couldn't be used in Alpine County, right? So that would be the reason to look at those others. But you're right, the treatment facility, it might involve some upgrades, but the treatment facility would be maintained. And the export line as it exists would also be part of
Okay,
this.
I think I was confused on one part of your presentation. So the grayed out things aren't completely eliminated. There's not the preferred alternatives at this point. Is that right?
They are correct. Those, relatively speaking to these 8, they have a higher level of regulatory and technical challenge right now,
Yeah.
right? But, you know, this plan is expected to go for, you know, the plan was looking at 50 years, right? Wastewater treatment changes in 50 years, right? And the need for water changes in 50 years. So, you know, those aren't off the table. Those exist in that the spaghetti decision diagram. You can land on any of these 8 alternatives, right? In depending on your pathway in that diagram. But then you need to do the evaluation and stack it up against the other ones that you land on to say, is this the best one? And those 4 that I sort of grayed out, those seem like they would be further down the road potentially, right? Because they have some significant challenges with them, relatively speaking. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
So just an observation, interpretation of kind of where we're landing is really, what are those alternatives that are gonna land us at the end of that decision tree? Like where, if you put a pachinko ball in, whatever, go through the decision tree. And so it's basically that range of areas where that ball's potentially gonna land, right?
Exactly.
It's, okay.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
So I guess that's the way I would think about it, that it's not like an environmental impact statement per se, and you're really pushing towards a certain direction, but this is really just, are we thinking thoroughly enough about what that range of options might be for the district.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, I think the key takeaway for this is that, for today, we have, arrived at a point where we are much more certain that we're continuing to do the right thing. Right? Because we looked at all the most viable alternatives, and they all include a lot of infrastructure cost and changes. And we don't have a driver leading us to make those sorts of massive changes.
Right.
So, continue doing what we're doing until there's a reason to change it. However, we do have these opportunities for enhancing the system through more energy recovery and constructed wetlands that may make us more resilient and more efficient.
Yeah.
A little less costly in our operation. So focus on those things in the near future, as well as addressing the aging infrastructure needs. Because to your point, all but one of these alternatives relies on all that existing infrastructure. And like the sea line is now more than 50 years old. And, so that becomes a big concern because most of the alternatives you're looking at needs it to be operational.
Is there any analysis of potential for revenue generation for the district? In terms of the different alternatives? I mean, obviously, I think with the inline power generation, obviously there's potential
Energy.
opportunity to, yeah.
Right.
There's potential for, recouping some of the costs it takes to pump it over, but I know you listed out the alfalfa field, so there's some revenue coming out of that. Are the ranchers, is there any kind of willingness for them to pay for some portion, or at least maybe the getting cost recovery for delivering that water to the ranches? I mean, is there any kind of analytics that are incorporated in the plan that relate to possibilities for revenue generation?
Yeah, so we looked at, DCLTSA does sell their recycled water, but it's not for very much money. So I believe, and I think the number isn't Tech Memo 3, but I believe that I calculated out that it's in the $10,000 to $15,000 a year. Let's just take the existing production of effluent. If you sold it at that same dollars per gallon cost, right? That as DCLTSA is getting, let's just say that that's the market for that level of recycled water, right? That level of quality of recycled water, then it's not a significant revenue, right? But, one piece of that multi-criteria decision analysis is economics, and it includes both capital and O&M costs and potential revenue. Now, we're sitting here today and that potential revenue is small. Could that revenue, or, could there be users that are willing to pay more for that water in the future? Sure, right? And in that case, you could adjust your scoring of the alternatives accordingly, right? And that would allow you to then incorporate that change in recycled water market, if you will, in a future evaluation, right? Where that might be a driver, right? Yes.
I think kind of follows on that thought, in terms of optionality, with evaluation of, like, say, the tracts of land, acreage in the city, because the concept of buying more land in vastly expanding flowers, agriculture use on the district's and having to revenue sources back. Because I see there's that's relatively cheap in Alpine County, all things being considered, to spend these costs to infrastructure that just deposit somewhere else where you get no fundamental return back on that. Because the critiques of government is a very government way of thinking about investment, right? And so I would look at large investment in terms of land ownership and expansion of existing ag development by the district.
And I certainly think that that would be, so let's say you are in a situation where you're anticipating a capacity gap, right? You need some capacity, or, I guess maybe you have an economic driver to change the uses of that water in Alpine County to different locations, right? But let's just say that there's maybe a need for additional recycled water capacity. If you then are looking towards, and our scenario, our analysis pointed towards alternative 2 under that scenario, well, you certainly would go back and look at, this is a strategy, right? We're not even yet at the master planning level, right? So you would want to go look at alternative 2 and a number of different options associated with that concept of alternative 2, including, as you're suggesting, what are the parcels that would make the most sense, right? And is there opportunity for more, more recovery on, or revenue from different types of uses, within the limitations of what secondary 2-3 recycled water could be used at, right? And then, if you're, then you could maybe also in that alternatives analysis do okay, well, alternative 3 is kind of close to alternative 2. Would I also at the same time, at that point in future, want to look at, okay, what do I get for going to disinfected tertiary at some point down the road, right? Would there be more of a market for that water? So I think that all of that is sort of future work that should and would happen if there is a trigger to do something other than the existing, right?
Exactly. And I, in terms of the renewable energy generation, the cost cited was, what is that included? I guess what I'm asking is, if you were just going to replace the sea line, for example, was the cost represented, what was the cost of the renewable energy, the cost shown on the screen?
That's a good question, and I have the same one. Can you go back to the slide with
Sure.
the energy recovery? Because it looked like, because you had to replace a portion of the sea line with option A, that includes the cost of replacing just that portion. And that B doesn't replace any portions, it just installs stations.
Right. And
So if you're gonna replace it anyway, then you do if you have to replace the sea line anyway, then you do an analysis of which of these two pencils out better, because you're breaking ground regardless.
right. The one addition to that, though, is to do unless you were going to do the energy recovery of A, that requires a steel pipeline, right, to handle those pressures. So if you're not going to, so that's the high cost of that section of pipeline being replaced, that's embedded in the cost of A, the 123 million. So it would be a different pipeline. Like if you had to replace the pipeline and you wanted to do an energy recovery and you didn't want to do anything beyond, basically the pressure tolerance of your existing pipeline, then you would be limited to B if you wanted to do energy recovery, right? If you are looking at increasing that energy recovery and replacing the pipeline, but being willing to make that cost, that investment into the higher cost pipeline, steel pipeline, then you're in the A option.
Any marginal.
Does that make sense?
What portion of the sea line is included in that 123 million?
It's Luther Pass Pump Station down.
All,
No, sorry. It's
I thought it was just the high pressure.
it's the top of Luther Pass and down.
Okay,
Yeah, sorry.
because you would back it all the way up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Julie, could you just refresh in terms of this energy value? What was the cost of the solar?
Here?
Yeah.
Oh, I think
Just real
the
ballpark.
value of it is somewhere, in the like $4 million, ballpark for 1 megawatt.
That's what you see on phone. This is.
Yeah.
It's right. It's a long time return.
Well, that's what I mean, it's like, if you have ranch land, like, just down, they don't, again, like, I love the idea of it. But I think there's other ways to get at it. And then just another question, and, in terms of the 30 acres for the wetland, I actually love that idea. Shit, what's that?
I said lots of questions on it too. In fact, I have a new alternative.
And my question was just why the 30 acres? Like, I mean, I know you just have to pick a number at some point, of course, but like, was there kind of a thought behind it, or was it just kind of that simple?
There was a topography thought behind it, kind of in this low-lying area, right? Because the idea was that you would have a relatively low-lying area that you could inundate with some depth of water, but at a roughly, you can only inundate your wetlands with so much water, right? Even temporarily. So we picked an area that we thought we could inundate with like 6 feet of water, right? The other limitation was that with this, and you can see even in adjacent to the area that we picked, is that you have at least previously mapped jurisdictional wetlands in this area, right? So that would all need to be, even though you're building a constructed wetland, if you are building something in jurisdictional wetlands, that is a much higher level of regulatory approval and permit to reach, right? So we stayed out of a lot of the green areas, right? With the idea that certainly if you were going to explore a constructive wetland, you would go out there and you'd survey it in detail and map those wetlands, map the wetland areas in detail and define that potential area, right? This was a very high level desktop analysis.
So this particular location, this is where the pipe daylights.
Yes.
There's a stream that runs through that. It meanders through there right now. So it's currently receiving treated or, water, secondary treated sewage. And then moves between that point into Harvey Place Reservoir. And it's ideal. And I think the concept would be that I think you would characterize it as primarily storage, but I think obviously there's uptake and infiltration.
Yep.
That plays out. So you probably get, some capacity gained from that perspective, but
Right.
I guess in my mind, that was just like a really obvious place to locate it, but I think there's opportunity all throughout a lot of portions of the land down there for a constructed wetland, not only for storage, but also for infiltration and plant uptake for capacity generation.
Could you give us costs on the?
I don't have costs on this system migration here. It just felt because there's a fair bit of, I think, still uncertainty in the feasibility, even though I think there might be a regulatory window because it is, there is wetland there now, right? But it has been created by the secondary 2-3 water, right? So does that give you an avenue for an easier path from a regulatory perspective? Maybe, not necessarily, but maybe. So we were, it's such a desktop analysis that we didn't really have the basis for, to do a cost estimate.
But the way you presented it, I feel like is very appealing. But basically making the connection between constructed wetlands and 10 extra days of storage. I mean, we've had twice in the last 7 years where we would have really liked to have that storage at the end of the season.
There's tons of potential there, but yeah, you're right. There's lots of uncertainty, regulatory uncertainty. And I think obviously conversations will need to be had. I guess, right now we're, irrigating ranch lands with it. And what is fundamentally the difference? And I think you probably get considerably more benefit out of a wetland than you would. Well, I guess there's specified slices. Benefit from grazing cattle or whatever. So there's an economic benefit probably of that. But
Right.
From a discharge perspective, it seems to me like it'd be fairly similar in that you're basically irrigating wetland versus a grassland or pasture. It's academic. Sort of conversation.
It is, although, constructed wetlands, like wastewater, constructed wetlands are sort of in the regulatory hierarchy are low, with respect to they're considered low from a resource agency perspective on their benefits, right? You know, constructed wetland is lower than a freshwater system wetland, right? And so I think it's I think that's where you run into trouble with looking at, oh, I have areas that are existing freshwater wetland. I'm going to replace those areas with a constructed wastewater wetland with secondary T3 water, right? And so that's where it gets tricky from a regulatory standpoint. There's a lot of area that has been mapped. You'd have to go and look for those pockets of opportunity, right? If they
I
exist.
would agree.
Yeah.
And I guess for me, currently, we're running pretty significant numbers of cattle on what are considered wetland on DVR property, and be an interesting conversation to be had.
It'd be an interesting conversation to be had. Yes. Yes. Any other questions or comments? Anybody put anything on the chat? No? Okay.
Is there anybody?
There are a few people, right? Snacks.
So do you want us to like point to somewhere? I mean, it seems to me, again, this is really just a decision support system in some ways, really. It's like really, you know, framing your circumstance and running it through and, you know, basically narrowed it down to these alternatives, and it's go with it from there. Because it sounds to me like even if you were to land on an alternative, there's still a considerable amount of planning and hurdle stuff that jump through.
Absolutely.
Regulation.
Right.
And financials and all that kind of stuff
Right.
still need to be worked through.
Yes, exactly.
Actually, but follow up, what's the situation in Alpine County right now? You mentioned needing to renegotiate, the arrangement that currently exists there.
I am not the expert on that, so I'm going to defer to
Well, with
somebody at the
rates of
district.
damage, sounds like, yeah.
Paul, do you want to talk about
Well, with the ranchers, the current contracts that are in place, set to expire in 2028.
Right.
And so we're gonna begin negotiations with them fairly soon. To have this conversation, you know, do they still want the water? How long do they want the water for? What are they anticipated doing with their property, and
Yeah,
go over from there.
because I imagine they wouldn't really have many alternatives if they intend to
Yeah.
continue branching activities for getting water. So it would just be if they were to get out of the ranching business, is that sort of thing?
Yeah, and we have not received any indication thus far that would lead us to believe that they are not interested in continue receiving the water.
Yeah.
That's what we're hoping for.
Okay, and then what was the mention about Alpine County and needing to work out renegotiate the current arrangement?
That's you too, Paul, to get you on.
Well, I can speak very little to that because it is some ongoing litigation, but there's just some disagreement in how and who regulates our operations down there in the county. So we're working to that.
Yeah, I'm feeling optimistic about the prospects of a amicable resolution there.
Yes, I think we'll definitely get to a
Yeah.
resolution.
Yeah, I think there's no more questions or comments. Yeah.
Any more questions?
So before you go into the next steps in this process, I guess, just to kind of give a sense of where we're going after. So we've got these branch contracts that we need to start discussions, right? But also we're just getting into our next budget process. We'll be having meetings with staff in the next, month or so to talk through like what we learned, from this process. And, you know, what are the next, steps in planning for the existing systems out there. I think we have a lot that we're taking away from this that's going to guide us in the immediate future for what kind of investments to make. So energy recovery, constructive developments, master planning for replacements of existing facilities.
Yeah, so the everything that Elisa talked about in even more detail is included in the draft recycled water strategic plan that's posted on our website. And so the cards that were handed out, they comment cards? Are comment cards, but there's also lots of opportunities to, as you review it and look at it, we've been hosting public meetings and stakeholder advisory group meetings for the last few years and been receiving comments, and there's still an opportunity to comment at this time. So you can go to the website, review it, email, call with questions, contact us. And then this, pending on comments received, we're planning on presenting the final recycled water strategic plan to the board during our normally scheduled board meeting on November 21st. Yeah.
Who's on the scientific advisory committee? I'm forgetting the acronym or like what specifically it was called.
Stakeholder.
So is that the only committee that was part of the process, or was there another more technical advisory group that was party to this?
The stakeholder advisory committee, that was the one committee.
Okay.
But that committee included people from regulatory agencies, the city, counties, the tribe, later nonprofits. So there were certainly technical people on there. We talked to people from Carson Watershed Sub-Conservancy District, as well as there were other reach outs on the regulatory side, not in the stakeholder advisory group, but we talked to regulators in Nevada, water rights folks in Nevada, and as well as the regional board. They participated as part of the stakeholder advisory group. Alpine County, yeah. It's a list. I'm certainly not remembering everybody. It's a list of maybe 30, roughly.
Long. We
Yeah.
cast the net wide.
Yeah. I did want to mention very quickly that on the webpage, you'll see 2 versions of the recycled water strategic plan.
And
And
posted one,
oh, you posted one.
the big one.
Okay.
Oh, you didn't post the other one?
Well, I can if you want me to.
Big one is like 900 pages.
Yeah. I posted the big one with all of the appendices, but we can also post the one that's just the report and not all the appendices. So, if you go to stpud.us under our recycled water strategic plan, it has all the recordings of the past public meetings. It has all the technical memos and legal and regulatory memos, as well as the draft plan for review. Awesome. Well, thank you all for coming out, and we're around for additional questions. So you know how to get a hold of us as well. Thanks for being a part of this.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.